you're back after surviving the implements that shall not be named from last week. Because we're 2023 now, I thought it'd be quite nice to have a look at the Sheffield Assay office. Just a brief look. We're not doing, we can't do the history. They'd be terribly offended if they thought they could do the history of the Sheffield Assay office in about 15 minutes on YouTube. They'd take that, they'd be crestfallen. But I just want to look at a few things from Sheffield and explain the stories around them. And the reason why we're talking about Sheffield is it's their 250th anniversary of the establishment of the Assay office. And I'm going to talk about that at another time, when Birmingham and Sheffield was set up, because I have a feeling that could take too long. Let's just say, at Sheffield in 1773, they established the Assay office. There was an Act of Parliament in February of that year. And then the first meeting, I've written it down there, you see my eyes go across, I can't remember everything. The first meeting, the first committee meeting, was the 5th of July, 1773. And unfortunately, president of that meeting was the Earl of Effingham. And this is why, frustratingly, the first date letter for the Sheffield Assay office isn't an A, and it doesn't run in alphabetical order. It's an E. It's an effing E. Effingham E. You'll never forget that now, will you? What's the first date letter for the Sheffield Assay office? It's the effing date letter, or the Effingham date letter. And after the E, after the E, they just seem to pick random letters. I mean, which scrambles your brain. It all comes right in the 19th century, but the first few decades of the Sheffield Assay office, they're all over the place. So go and buy yourself a book of hallmarks, because even I can't remember those. When they were established, they were obviously producing items in silver, which is why they wanted an assay office. They were also producing a lot of things in silver plate, and had been doing that in Sheffield plate for decades earlier, since the 1740s. And this meant that all the manufacturers were set up for the production, or largely set up for the production, in both materials, in Sheffield plate and in silver. And they used the same tools, the same workmen, and the same technique to work both Sheffield plate, and I'll tell you what that is in a minute, and silver. Now, Sheffield plate is, and again very quickly, it is a sandwich of thicker copper and a thinner sheet of silver on top, fused together. And because the materials have very similar properties, they work together, they don't fight against one another, and you can roll them, cut them and solder them, and they'll behave. But it does mean you are always working with rolled sheet. This is the heart, the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. It's all about working with a rolled sheet material. Now, in silver, you, of course, can form a sheet of silver, you can hammer it, you can cast it. So this had benefits and restrictions for the Sheffield silversmiths. If you wanted to make, say, a pair of candlesticks in Sheffield, and that was one of the biggest things that they made in Sheffield plate, was the production of lighting, candlesticks, candelabra, you couldn't cast the material. If you melted Sheffield plate down, you got this sort of horrible mixture of copper and silver which fooled nobody. So they had to develop techniques to form what would be a cast pair of candlesticks in London. They would simply make a two-piece mould for the stem, cast the silver in two pieces, slightly hollow, solder them together. They would cast the foot, solder that on, hey-ho, a candlestick. In Sheffield, as I say, they used the same techniques for silver and Sheffield plate, and that meant stamping. Now, this is the first thing I'm going to show you. How big is he? Doesn't that candlestick look small? He must be enormous. No, this is a taper stick, before any of you think I am a giant. This is the first interesting, it has a story to tell more than beyond it being a beautiful Georgian taper stick. Ostensibly, if you were to look at this, you would turn it round and you'd look at that lovely set of hallmarks there. Aren't they superbly struck? And they are. You'd have a look under your eyeglass and you'd see that they bear the mark of Makepeace and Carter. Very good London firm of silversmiths, Makepeace and Carter. And they're stamped for London in 1777. And then you think, well, he's had a turn because he's talking about Sheffield silver. So why is he showing us a London taper stick? It's not a London taper stick. If you get an eyeglass, which is one of these, go and get one of these. They're jolly useful. And you peer at these marks long enough, you notice something a bit strange. First of all, Makepeace and Carter's mark is struck, but there's something underneath it. It's like a letterbox mark, and there's a C and an O that they haven't managed to obliterate. The standard mark is pretty deep, but there's a sort of faint, odd outline around that as well. And it becomes most telling when you look at the leopard's head, and I'll get a very detailed photograph of this and pop this on Instagram so you can really zoom in on it. And if you look at the leopard's head, it's a beautiful impression of the leopard's head, but there's the outline, sort of pentagram, sort of outline of a crown, which of course is the Sheffield town mark. And again, the date letter superbly struck, deeply, cleanly, crisply struck, but over something else. This taper stick was not made in London. It was made in Sheffield, and we can tell who made it because as fastidious as Makepeace and Carter were in trying to obliterate any notion of it coming from Sheffield, they did forget the nozzle. I say they forgot it. They did it bears their mark as well, but then you can see they've sort of done it half-heartedly, and you can see the large maker's mark of John Love and Co. of Sheffield, who were specialists in making candlesticks and taper sticks and all sorts of things. And this spoke about the supply of these objects and the fact that they could be produced much cheaper in Sheffield, so much cheaper than casting, so much less silver is used in the manufacture, along a sort of Sheffield plate style of manufacturing, stamping all of these sections. You can see this foot, well, that one piece there, that is one stamping of a sheet of metal. That is one stamping. It's all continuous. They are brought together. They are soldered. Now, if it was Sheffield plate, that solder line would hide any signs of copper. They may even stamp the whole foot in one piece. The stem again, it is stamped in two halves. Remember, in London, they're going to cast it in two halves in solid silver, but in Sheffield, they're just stamping it. The cost of making the dies and the moulds to stamp it is negated by the fact they are making these in such large numbers and supplying them not only to London, not only to retailers in Birmingham and the West Country, they are supplying them across the globe. The odd thing I find is that, and this probably shows the needle between London and Sheffield. Remember, Sheffield had been petitioning to set up their own assay office alongside Birmingham for years. And actually in London, they'd been blocking them for some time because they thought, well, you know, we've got all the power and influence. We don't want to share it. Now, things are much happier these days. We all rub along. But can you imagine going into Goldsmiths Hall today with a fully hallmarked piece of silver from Sheffield and saying, would you lads mind just obliterating the Sheffield assay office marks and just striking it over yourself? And they go, clear off, it's already assayed. Not in it's 1777 this was made, not within the first 4 years of the establishment of the Sheffield Assay office. They appear, with the depth and precision that they've overstruck these marks, to have done it with glee at the London Assay office. You'd like any notion of this being a Sheffield candlestick obliterated from the face of the earth? We will happily oblige you. Step this way. That tells its own story, I think, about attitudes of various assay offices to one another, and also the fact that, I mean, in later years, pieces would still be supplied by Sheffield and by other makers, and goldsmiths would just be happy to overstrike the mark. They wouldn't worry that it bore the hallmarks of another assay office. But at the time, even though this is beautifully made, it was perceived that Sheffield silver was in some way less. It was lighter, it still did the same job. And actually this, I mean, they do, if they're vigorously polished, because they are sheet silver, they do tend to split on the high points and hole in the decoration. This one is pristine, which is the only reason I've got it. And it's got a beautiful widow's lozenge to it. But that's a little moment in history, and that tells us about the attitudes between the two assay offices. Now I'm going to show you another couple of things that add to this story, but I'm going to do it in part 2 because uploading long videos onto social media takes forever. So I'm trying to make them shorter and engage you, and not send you all to sleep. Send you all to sheep. No, this isn't from Wales, I promise you. So I will see you in a bit for Sheffield part 2.